Hi, and I'm here to show you how to set up Arch Linux on a virtual machine. I have a virtual machine here set up in XCP-NG, which is a fork of Zen virtual server. Here is my virtual machine with 16 gigs of RAM. It's got 8 cores across 2 different processors. You can see we got 2 sockets with 4 cores per. It's prepped to UEFI boot and as well boot from DVD drive. We have our Arch Linux live distro ready to go. And let's go ahead, move to the console and start it up. Now what I have done here is I've already created a pre-existing set of commands for making this installation quick and easy. I will be converting that into a script soon, but what you all will be able to witness here is really just how quickly you can set up Arch Linux. So we're going to boot into our install environment here. And right now we're looking in the console of XCP-NG VM, our Arch Dev VM. Which I don't like working out of the console. It doesn't give you all the copy-paste functionality because we're running off of a live distro. And this particular distro doesn't have the guest tools necessary for us to copy-paste. And it gets a little squirrely sometimes clicking around in the console. I don't like it. Sometimes the cursor can get lost. So what I want to do is I want to SSH into this from my main machine. And the way to do that is first, once we're booted into our live environment, we need to go ahead and set a password for the root user. The root user password is currently null. That's how it gets us to the prompt without any issue here. But let's go ahead and set up the password for the root user in the live environment. So we'll go like this, PASSWD. Don't type out password, type out passwd. Enter. Set up the password of your choice. Nice. Now the password has been updated successfully. This live live environment also has SSH capability out of the box, so we're just going to go to that. All right. And I'm going to SSH into my machine. We'll accept the certificate that it is posing to us for SSH. And then I'm going to resize this window so you guys can see everything. Nice. All right, now we're going to log in as root. And we'll put in the password that we just set. Cool. Now we're in. And we're not dealing with some fuddy-duddy console. And we can copy and paste commands easily into this. So, first thing we do for our Arch Linux install is set up the keyboard type, which is US. And that's done with the load keys command. Next thing we do is we're going to make sure that we have all the EFI loading tools and firmware. Yes, we do. If this gives you an error or something, you have not properly booted into environment that will support you setting up your Arch Linux distro to use UEFI. Then we're going to set our time to use Network Time Protocol, or NTP. Time is important in these matters because if the time is not synchronized properly, you could get errors and some problems with installing because your time is not aligned to the actual time of maybe a server that you might be downloading from. And that can be seen as suspicious. So now we look at setting up our partitions for Arch Linux. These are going to contain a boot partition or an EFI system partition, going to contain a swap partition and also a root file system partition where everything lives. The swap partition is specifically just for handling. It's like a paging memory in Windows. But let's begin. First, let's set the label of our disk to a GPT. Do not do MBT or MBR. I'm sorry. Do not do MBR. Make sure it's GPT or else you will not be able to do UEFI. All right, so we set it to GPT. Now let's make our system partition or our boot partition. Here we set, voice crack, we set the ESP is EFI system partition, and it's using FAT32. It starts in the 2048 sector, and it's a total size of 500 megabytes. Okay. Next, we're going to make our swap partition. It starts from where that last partition left off, and it sets aside 16 gigs because we have 16 gigs of RAM. Thus, I set my swap for the same size. Next, our last partition that we will make is the root partition, where all of the files for our Arch Linux distro are going to go. And it's going to take up the rest of the disk space. Remember, our total disk space is 100 gigs. And this is going to pick up from the swap partition, and any space left after will be assigned to this partition. Nice. Now, just to let you know, the -S is a script flag, so it will mute any feedback that the command might originally give you when you run it, when you run this parted command. Also, the -A optimal flag, that is for making sure that the sectors properly align so you don't get errors on your file systems. This can be a problem if you don't know how to exactly set your sector size and your sector positioning for each partition. So we go ahead and run a -A optimal. All right, looks like everything is good there. Now it's time to start setting our file system types. So first thing, we're going to set the first partition to EFI system partition on. All right. Then we're going to also make file system FAT32 on the first partition. So it might seem a little redundant from the last step, but it's necessary. So we're doing make file system FAT with the switch or the flag F32 for 32-bit, and we're pointing it to the first partition, XVDA1. Now, your partition may simply be SDA1, and that will be because you're not using a virtual environment. If you see dev/SDA1 or dev/SDA when you are setting up these partitions, that is because you are using a you're actually loading up your Arch Linux on hardware and not in a virtualization environment. All right, so now we have our first partition properly set to the ESP and FAT32 file system. Next, let's make a swap partition or assign. Really, we're making a swap partition, or we're making an existing partition swap. So our second partition, we're making that our swap partition. And then our third partition, which is our root partition, we are setting that to the ext4 or the ext4 Linux file system. All right. And that's pointing to the third partition known as XVDA3. Nice. A little thinking it did there, but we're good. Next thing we want to do is make a mount directory. We're going to call it an MNT directory, but it stands for mount. So we're going to make an MNT directory, and we use the parent switch when we do so. Then we're going to actually mount the root partition to the MNT directory, like so, by using the mount command and the source directory and the mount directory here. Then we're going to do the same thing for the system or boot directory. Let's make a boot directory. So it's going to be under mnt/boot/EFI. And then we're going to mount it on the first partition, or XVDA1. So now we're mounting what we just created to that first partition. Last part of our partition sweat is we're going to set the swap on to our second partition. Now earlier we instantiated the second partition as a swap, but here we actually are engaging it as a swap partition. Now at this point you can do a list block or LSBLK, and you're going to be able to see these partitions and their file systems accordingly. Another way to do that is if you use fdisk-L for list, and we can see the same thing. These are important to check because you want to make sure that your system partition or your first partition is EFI system. If it says Microsoft bytecode file system or something like that, you did not follow my steps correctly. Go back and check again. You want to see EFI system for your first partition, Linux swap for your second, and Linux file system for your third partition. All right? Good. Now, the next thing is we're going to load up our base tool set for Arch Linux. And this is going to allow us to finish setting up, or really just set up altogether, our operating system. So what we have here is Packstrap, and we're looking at Linux firmware tools to be installed, base development tools, our Grub bootloader, our EFI boot manager, Nano, and network manager. A lot of those are self-descriptive. Nano is a text tool. And think about Notepad in Windows. Nano is something to the effect of that. EFI boot manager. Grub is our bootloader. That's what allows us to load into Arch Linux when it hits our boot sector. So let's just run this packstrap command and get all of these packages installed. Now once this finishes up, it may take longer or shorter for you depending on the resources that you've allocated. Now once you have run that command, you're going to want to check the file systems table. All right. So the file systems table can be generated, and then we'll look at it. So we're going to do gen file system table, or really gen fs tab. Some people call it gen fstab. It's really gen fs tab. And we'll go /mount or MNT. All right, now this is currently the file system table as we see it. Notice we have Linux file system represented as ext4 on the third partition. We have vfat, or the FAT32 partition, along with the EFI boot on partition 1. And we also have our swap partition set up on partition 2. Nice. Let's go ahead and copy that to the necessary fstab represented as such. So now we run the command gen fstab dash uppercase U space / mount, and then it copies to /mount / etc / fstab. Nice. Now, if we nano into that, we should see the same exact output. Nice. We see our ext4 pointing to our root partition. We see vfat, or FAT32, and the boot EFI assigned to the first partition, or XVDA1, and we see our XVDA2, or our second partition, being given the swap feature. Nice. We can close that. So we have now copied our fstab file. Next, we want to chroot into our MNT folder. This is going to take us out of our live environment, and now we are sitting right there in our actual install environment. All right. Now, the first thing we want to do once we're in our install environment is set the local time. So we do that by making a symbolic link from the zone info directory and point to the proper time zone directory that is right for you. For me, it is US Eastern. And the symbolic link will point to etc/local time. So really, before I do that, I'm gonna prove it to you. We'll do date. You can see it's in UTC time. And then I'm going to set this to US Eastern, that symbolic link. And now when we hit date again, notice how it's in Eastern time. And that clock is 100% correct. Now, one thing that was really bothering me was when I would go to time, date, CTL, we don't see the Eastern time zone reflected in that. And that was bothering me. So we fixed that with this command. Set time zone in the time date control tool. So we still do the exact same thing. It's pointing to US Eastern. And now watch this. When I open up time date control again to look at it, it's no longer set to UTC on the local time. It is now ETC. Nice. And check it out. Remember when we set it to NTP, Network Time Protocol, at the very beginning of this project? It's set to active. Still remembers that. Nice. Now, earlier, after we ran our packstrap command way up here, check it out. It said, please check your locale settings. Okay, so we will. We're going to generate locale. And these are going to give specificity to our character set and our key map set. So we can actually set, now we're going to set our character encoding set to UTF-8 by doing this. We're doing an echo command of the line we want inserted, and we're creating a file called locale.config or .conf. All right. We can verify that if we go nano etc locale.conf. So you can see that's all we did. We just wrote this little line into a file. Simple as that. Let's do the same thing with our key map console. We want our key mappings to be US. And we also want to set our host name, which in this case is archdev. All right. Now this next part, pay close attention. We want to create a user. Right now, we are in an environment where we are piggybacking off of this root user to run all of these commands. Well, we need to have a user that we actually log into. You don't sit on a machine and do everything as the administrator. You elevate privileges as necessary. So we're going to do that. We're going to set a user, create a user, and then B, we're going to give it the ability to run as an administrator or sudo in the Linux world. So if you want to ad hoc run something as an administrator with the user that you're logged in as, you use the sudo command. But in order to run that sudo command, you need to make sure that that user that you run the sudo command against is in the sudoers file and has proper sudo permissions. And here's how we do that. First, we add the user. In this case, I'm making a user called doc for Docker, short for Docker. User add is the command. -G puts this user in a group called wheel. We'll get into that later in the sudoers file. Then the username, as you can see, is doc, D-O-C. So we added that user, but we did not set a password for that user yet. So we're going to go PASSWD space DOC. So we're saying, hey, let's set the password for doc. And give it a nice password. Cool. Next, we created the doc user, or we created that user, but he still doesn't have permissions to act as an administrator when the sudo command is run. So let's go ahead and make sure that that ability is set for our user. The way we do that is we type in editor equals nano. So we're going to use the nano editor and vi sudo. All right. And we're going to look for a line to uncomment relating to the wheel group. Remember, I told you about that wheel group. So here we are. Uncomment this line to allow all members of group wheel to execute any command. So now if I was to uncomment this, anytime I wanted to execute a command as an administrator when I am the user named doc, I'm going to have to put in a password. That can get annoying sometimes. So what I'm actually going to do, and this is a little less secure, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do the same wheel allowance, but this time it does not ever ask for a password. So basically my user by default is an administrator, but we are never running as root. So we've set up a safeguard for our user. And yes, we want to save that. Nice. Now, in addition to this user, since we have rooted into this particular installation environment from the live environment, we also need to update the root user password again. Now, for this particular install, sure. For the live environment, we're in SSH as the root user and we set that password. But we want to set that password forever for the root user. And I'm going to do that here, because I'm already in there as root. And then I'm going to set another password. Oh, I fumbled it. Let me do it again. Okay. Perfect. So now we've created a user named doc that has sudo privileges, and we also set up the user root to have a password for when we actually run our Arch Linux out of the box for the first time. So we'll have a choice to log in as root or doc. All right. Next thing we want to do is enable the network manager, and that is done with the system control, enable network manager. Simple enough. Now for the grub. Grub is what allows us to boot. It literally looks at the boot partition and says, hey, what can I boot into? So we're going to run grub install against our partition or against our disk. Okay, now grub is installed on the disk. Now we're going to configure it. So we're going to give it the out-of-box configuration, and then we point it to the configuration file. Like so. All right. Now remember, we are rooted into our installation environment. Let's back out one step and go back to our live environment by typing exit. And now we're back in our live environment. And then we just want to unmount all the mounts that we did earlier. We want to unmount them. So we're using the umount command with the capital R switch for recursive. And now we've unmounted out of everything. All right. So we are good to go. That is the full install. Now all that's left to do is reboot and make sure that our environment boots into Arch Linux. And of course, there's things to do after. You're going to want to tweak and settle your environment in the way you like. But we've gotten the hard stuff out of the way. So here we are. We jumped back into our console from the SSH root. And I'm just going to type in shutdown. Okay. So this thing's going to shut down any moment now. And I believe we'll know it's shut down when this, here we go, when our SSH session closes out. This is a 30-minute video, but I guarantee you, once you get these commands down, the installation will take you 15 minutes, possibly 10. There we go. Shutting down, shutting down. There we go, going down for power off. And we got our SSH error because we were connected and we lost it. So I can close that window. Let me jump back into my console. We are going to eject our boot disk. So now it's empty. And when we spin this bad boy back up, we should be booting right. We should see the grub bootloader. And then we should see the Arch Linux prompt. Nice. Awesome. Here we are. And we can log in as root, or we can log in as that user I created. And we're in there. All right. That's how you install Arch Linux using a set of commands in sequence. I advise anyone who plans on spinning up multiple instances of Arch Linux or any Linux distro that you run off a command line for installation, go ahead and make a script. I'll be taking these commands and retrofitting them to an actual script so I can literally boot into the live environment and then run the .sh command, and it will handle everything for me. that's my next step to this project, but I hope you learned something about Arch Linux and getting it set up. I did. I'm learning every day. Appreciate you spending the time. Be sure to check back in for more IT and system engineering and anything else that interests me, demos, reviews, and reactions. Thanks, you guys. Be good.